Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to be talking about something that is incredibly applicable to your farm here this afternoon, whether you may like it or not. That's not the point. We're going to be talking about the Federal Milk Marketing Order, or FMMO here for short, in just a moment, especially when we think about what does this mean as a dairy producer. We've got some great discussion points coming up for you here today. And I hope you're going to join us on that discussion by asking your questions via the Slido feature. If you're watching live with us, you can do so on the right of the screen if you're on a desktop device. And if you're on a mobile device, you can scroll on down below and type in your questions throughout on that portion. But joining us this afternoon, we have Dr. Chuck Nicholson, who is a friendly face to the Dairy Signal. We've had him on several times before, and we're excited to welcome him back. And if you're not familiar, Dr. Nicholson is the Associate Professor in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences, as well as Agriculture and Applied Economics at UW-Madison. And we also have Jack Meyer, who is a PhD student in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences at UW-Madison as well. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us here this afternoon. We're excited to dive into this information, especially as, like I said before, whether we like it or not, it's going to have an impact, at least in some way, shape, or form, on what it looks like on our milk check. But before we dive into that, would you mind each giving us a little bit of introduction about yourself?
Sure. Why don't I go ahead first? So I'm Chuck Nicholson. I'm at UW-Madison, but I have been doing dairy economics work since before my hair was gray. And so I'm happy to have the opportunity to share some of the thoughts that we have about what's coming up here in terms of price changes next month, and then how we actually think about and can try and analyze the things that will happen now and in the future. So thanks. Thanks very much for having us, Amber.
Well, we're excited to have you joining us here again, Dr. Nicholson. As always, it's a pleasure to have you on. But Jack, would you mind giving us a little bit of information about yourself as well?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amber. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jack Myers. I'm a PhD student here in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am originally from Central Michigan, did not grow up on a dairy farm, but milked cows in high school and fell in love with the industry, and I've been here ever since. So did my undergrad in dairy science at Iowa State. My master's was actually in food science at Kansas State University, and I combined both my dairy production and dairy foods knowledge together to work with dairy markets and economics in my PhD program under Dr. Nicholson. So looking forward to having a very nice conversation today about changes to federal milk marketing orders and why we maybe need to develop some new analytical tools to assess them.
Well, we're excited to dive into this, especially as it is such a big piece of what goes on as we are dairy farmers. I mean, we do need to be paid, but it's going to give us an insight, a little bit more on what it all means as a producer and from the producer lens, coming from the analytical side of things and the tools for assessing it. So with all that being said, Jack, I'm going to pass it over to you, get us started. But for those who are watching, we're going to ask questions intermittently, so get them in whenever you feel like it, as well as at the end. So with that being said, Jack, take it away.
Actually, I think I'm going to take it away, but that's okay.
I am so sorry, Dr. Nicholson. I didn't mean to cut you off here.
Yeah, no worries. I guess there's two things. One, I want to point out that even though Jack did not come to UW-Madison for his dairy science degree, we still welcome him here later on in life. So that's good. And the other thing I'll mention is that this is Jack's baptism to the Dairy Signal. So this is his first time doing this. So I hope this is the first of future opportunities for him to contribute to the educational programming that you guys have developed. So I want to provide maybe a little bit of background on this because there's a lot of great content on the Dairy Signal, and some of that is sort of like very directly applicable to your farm immediately after you hear somebody talk about it. And some of the things we'll talk about maybe have a little bit of that flavor. We're going to talk a little bit about how component values will be changing, and that, it was going to be something that could affect particularly nutritional management on dairy farms. But we also want to talk a little bit about the kind of background. How do we get to the point where we make these kinds of decisions, like what USDA made, what the implications are more broadly over time. And that actually has maybe less direct farm management relevance, but it has dairy industry organization relevance. So communicating with your co-op leadership, communicating with your milk buyer about these things. We think it actually helps to be maybe a little bit better informed about where this came from and what it's likely to mean. And so we're going to frame it up kind of that way. We're also going to talk a little bit about how there's some limitations on what we know about what's likely to happen. and how we probably need a kind of a next generation of kind of the economic analysis part, which is what Jack's working on for his PhD work, to help us better understand and predict things going forward. So that's a little bit of the framing up for it. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jack to let him speak the words of wisdom here that he has to share.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Nicholson, for that very nice introduction. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started here. So kind of a little bit about the outline of today's presentation, our flight path, if you will, of what we're going to discuss. We're first going to start off with some dialogue about what changes will be implemented in June of this year, so next month, under the current federal milk marketing order pricing scheme, and kind of what that may look like for impacts on the milk check. We're then going to talk about how economic models were used to provide evidence for these changes in the hearing that USDA held down in Mount Carmel, Indiana, a few years ago. We're then going to talk about how the price impacts for these different proposed changes were analyzed and how the USDA derived their final decision, and then talk about why we need some new economic models to assess federal milk marketing orders and any potential future changes that may come to them over the next several years or decades. We're then going to wrap up with a conversation about what tools are actually appropriate to build out and then to study how these changes will impact federal orders. So to kind of begin, I think it's important that we have a little bit of a primer about what federal milk marketing orders are and what they do and how they calculate kind of that milk price that comes in the milk check every other week. So in general, federal milk marketing orders are 11 geographically defined regions in the United States under USDA's jurisdiction that calculate the minimum price that processors must pay to dairy farmers for milk on a per hundredweight basis. Now, each one of these federal orders divides milk into 4 distinct classes. So class 1 is going to be typically your fluid milk products. That's going to be fluid milk that goes directly to consumption, whether that be in the grocery store or school lunch program. Class 2 is typically going to be your ice cream and yogurt, your soft products. Class 3 incorporates cheese, which is particularly important for the upper Midwest here in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And lastly, class 4 is going to include butter. And overall, across the United States, about 75% of all the U.S. farm milk produced actually is priced through the federal order system. And then we kind of look at the figure here and kind of think about where federal orders are distributed geographically across the United States. There are some areas and some states that have their own pricing structures, but in general, the most of the milk produced and marketed is under the federal order system. It's also important to recognize that these are updated pretty infrequently. And the last time there was a significant change to the federal order system was 2008. So it's been pretty widely debated by the industry that now was the time to definitely do an order and an update to the federal order system. So what are some of the goals of federal milk marketing orders as they are legally defined? So there are 4 primary goals for federal milk orders. And the first, and I think it's one of the most important to understand, is as legally defined, they ensure orderly fluid milk markets. Their goal is also to improve the income of dairy farmers. However, it's not necessarily designed to guarantee them a profit, but it is designed to improve their income. The third is to oversee trade in milk markets to achieve equitable bargaining, and the equitable bargaining is between dairy farmers and processors. And lastly, and maybe some would say this is one of the most important, is it's to guarantee consumers an adequate supply of safe fluid milk. One of the other goals is to generate a classified price that is calculated through surveyed commodities. And these commodities are cheese, butter, whey, and non-fat dry milk. And USDA collects their prices and they're presented in the National Dairy Product Sales Report. And what comes out of the National Dairy Product Sales Report, commonly referred to as the NDPSR, is going to be what's used to calculate the price for those commodities that ultimately drive the farm milk price. It's also important to understand that there are some other functions to federal milk marketing orders that do not include calculating that minimum price for farmers. And one of the big ones is to generate market information and transparency. So across each of the 11 orders in the United States, they generate data on product and milk pricing information that's available to both dairy farmers, dairy processors, academics, government organization, and policymakers. And they also generate utilization reports by classes of milk. So when we look at federal orders and where they're utilizing milk, we can go into the federal order data and say, okay, we can see that 93% of the milk produced and marketed through the federal orders under Federal Order 30, which is between Wisconsin and Minnesota, goes to class 3 or goes to cheese, versus when we look at other orders such as Florida or Arizona, we can understand where they're utilizing most of their milk produced. So in Florida, that's going to primarily be in fluid milk. And then we look at Arizona, kind of a blend between fluid and cheese. Federal orders also do audits and verifications, and the audits are to ensure that milk testing is in compliance with federal regulations. So ultimately, it's to ensure that what the components that are being delivered to the plant are what's actually being reported by the handler themselves. And again, they're going to verify the testing of these different milk components. One of the last and probably the most important, it's to ensure that farmers are paid accurately and in a very timely manner as well. So kind of jumping into some dialogue about where we are at with federal order changes and what's been going on in the last three years, we definitely know that the last 3 years or last couple years have been crazy in terms of dairy policy. The headlines have been filled with, updating milk price differentials, the FMMO hearing dragged into 2024, which was one of USDA's longest. 2024 was a huge year for dairy policy work. And then ultimately this year, dairy farmers voted for all the changes to the federal order. So what was kind of going on and what's been going on over the last couple of years that have led to these headlines? So in March 2023, there was an initial request by the dairy industry for a hearing on make allowances. A couple months later in June, there were additional proposals submitted to USDA. And in August of 2023, USDA begins the process of modernizing the federal milk marketing orders, and they begin their hearing in Mount Carmel, Indiana. The hearing drags out into January of 2024. Was one of, if not the longest of USDA's hearing. And ultimately on July 1st of 2024, the final recommended decisions were issued by USDA based on the content presented in that hearing. November of 2024, a final decision was issued by USDA after a public comment period was opened. And then in January of 2025, producers voted to accept the final decision as put forth by USDA. Now it brings us to June of this year, where the pricing formula changes will actually be implemented across the United States and across all 11 federal milk orders. So what is going to happen to federal orders beginning in June of this year? So one of the first and probably the most widely talked about was the increase in make allowances for cheese, butter, non-fat dry milk, and dry whey. And those are going to be an increase of about 5 cents to 7 cents per pound across all 4 of those commodities. We're also going to see an increase in the Class 1 location differentials across the United States. So when we aggregate those Class 1 location differentials, which are essentially the county by county differential that is added to that Class 1 price based on the location of where that processor is. So when we think about that across the state of Wisconsin, that's about $1.20 across the entire state, aggregated on a county by county basis. We're then going to revert back to the higher of the advanced class 3 or the class 4 skim milk price. And we're going to also have a class 1 milk price adjusted for extended shelf life milk. We're going to see some changes in milk composition. Protein goes up a little bit. It was previously at 3.1%. That goes up to 3.3. Other solids was previously at 5.9. That goes up to 6%. And non-fat solids, which were previously at 9.0, will increase to 9.3%. And probably lastly, we will see that cheese barrels will be removed from the Class 1 pricing formulas, and that USDA is only going to generate that cheese price based now only on 40-pound blocks.
Let me maybe jump in here quick with one additional thing. So the change in milk composition that you were just talking about, Jack, that's actually about how we report like a Class 3 price. So we would take like a protein value now and multiply it by 3.1%. In the future, when we're telling what that Class 3 price is, it's 3.3%. And the same thing applies to the other solids and for Class 4, the non-fat solids. So that's actually kind of more of a reporting convention than anything else, because it doesn't actually change the component values. It just changes what the reported Class 3 price for Class 4 price is going to be. So sorry to interrupt there, but I thought I'd maybe just clarify that a little bit.
No worries. So then when we look at all of the key elements of the final rule as put forth by USDA, probably some of the largest price impacts will likely be in both the increased make allowance and the increased Class 1 location differentials.
So Jack, before we move on to this, we did have a question come in via Slido, and I want to ask it because they technically asked it during the goals portion, but I feel like now might be a nice place to put it as we talk about some of the changes. The question reads, you mentioned one of the goals of the FMMO is to improve income of dairy farmers, but from everything I've been reading, in the Wisconsin region, it's actually going to reduce our milk price. What are your thoughts or comments on that? And it's a hard question. They came right in with it.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're actually going to talk in a minute about the potential magnitude of the impacts on milk prices, and what happens to your particular milk price on your farm depends a lot on where you're selling your milk now, how it's being pooled by a co-op, and whether or not your milk was being pooled consistently prior to that. So it's a little bit of a tricky story to sort out for any one farm. In general, increase in the make allowances, as you'll see here in a minute, is going to result in lower component values. And so for the same component test of milk, the minimum payment would be lower. But there's kind of a lot of again, moving pieces to that. Will we see some milk price premiums come back that we haven't really seen for a while? Will we see less kind of reblending or deducts by co-ops? So generally, you might say that milk price is going to go down for many people if their milk was previously pooled. And that doesn't seem consistent with the idea of generating higher incomes for dairy farmers for sure. But overall, the reason to make those changes is to actually maintain the system's integrity so that it's actually doing the job that it was supposed to do. So the short-term issue is, yes, you might see a lower milk price. The longer-term issue is the presence of those federal milk marketing orders is a key policy decision that we've had in place for now nearly 100 years that actually has kind of proven itself as a way to improve dairy farmer income. So this change is not really going to be working so much in that direction, although the Class 1 differentials might help in some parts of the country. But maintaining the system and having it function the way it's supposed to provides benefits in terms of income for dairy farmers. This is kind of the long historical view that we have on that. I don't know, Jack, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that puts it pretty succinctly, Dr. Nicholson.
Okay, well, I'll let you guys continue on. I apologize. I really just did sneak that one in there, and it might be something that we can kind of talk a little bit more about maybe once we get to those more example portions later on here. So I'll let you keep going for now.
All right. So thank you for that question. And then looking at now how farm milk is priced based on dairy product prices, is the goal of the federal orders is to set a minimum price for milk. And then when we look at kind of some of the key products from cheese making, such as cheese, dry whey, and butter, ultimately we're trying to calculate that minimum price for that milk. And how can we relate that price of farm milk to what those final products are worth as determined by USDA? So when we look at kind of a formula for farm milk for cheese, we can look at kind of product prices. We're going to look at the butter price, the cheddar cheese price, and the dry whey price. These are going to be monthly market prices as calculated and determined by USDA. I'm then going to look at component values, and out of the butter price, we're going to find that butter, calculate that butter fat price, that protein price that's important that drives the cheese price, and then the other solids price that's going to drive that dry whey price, and looking at our component values. And ultimately, based on all of that, including that interaction between the butterfat price and the protein price, is going to be what calculates the minimum price for farm milk used by cheesemakers in the United States. And that the value of all the components, at least for the Class 3 formula, is the value of the milk based on the component pricing system. When we look at a typical product formula price, and we'll look at butter here, is we can see that the butterfat price is a function of both that butter price, again, as calculated by USDA, minus that make allowance price. And that make allowance price is what it takes to transform milk into 1 pound of butter. And then we can take the yield factor, to say, okay, how many pounds of butter can be made from 1 pound of butterfat? So ultimately, when we put it all together, subtract out the make allowances and multiply that yield factor, we're going to get the final butterfat price that is going to fall under the Class 3 pricing formula.
And maybe, actually, Jack, can you maybe slide back to that previous slide there just a second? So
Mhm.
just to help maybe folks understand a little bit of the logic of that, Jack said you start with a butter price that's collected, reported from the market prices that we have. So that changes every month. And then you subtract off some amount of money that we call the make allowance, which is really like a manufacturing cost. And this was a major point of contention in the hearings about what really that value should be for not just butter, but for cheese, dry whey, and non-fat dry milk. But folks, I think, maybe already have a sense that if you start with one make allowance value and raise it, you're subtracting a bigger number from that butter price. And that's going to mean that the butterfat price is going to be lower with a bigger make allowance. And I imagine a lot of folks have heard that that's kind of the way this works. And so that's why increasing the make allowances got the attention that it did, because it has sort of that consistent effect of lowering the component values, butterfat, protein, other solids, non-fat solids. Okay, so we put this up here to kind of help folks realize that that's kind of the basic logic of what's going on here. And we can talk a little bit more about sort of why those values were raised that way, given that they were going to lower the component values. So I'll let you carry on there, Jack, with some information about what we estimate kind of the impacts might be.
So yeah, as Dr. Nicholson mentioned, there will be some impacts with that change in the make allowances. And when we look at kind of what's milk valued on, specifically with that Class 3 reported price, we're going to see about 32 cents off per hundredweight. And that's going to include the compositional change in milk as well. Then when we look at the pool value of the Class 3 components, that's an additional about 91 cents off per hundredweight, and that's the component values at the standard test. Now, when we drop down to the Class 4 price, the reported value, about 43 cents off per hundredweight. Again, this is including kind of that compositional change. Then when we look at those Class 4 components, based on the pool value, about 74 cents off, and that's based, again, on the component values at the standard test. It's a little bit unsure what the price might be for milk that is not currently pooled. There could be an increase if premiums return or milk is eventually pooled. And then when we think about milk that is being pooled by a cooperative, but with it being reblended, we also are a little bit unsure, and it may not change very much. And overall, the net impacts of the make allowances are not really well known, but overall, our estimation is that it could be small.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here a little bit and provide some additional feedback about this as well. So what this is saying is if you look at a reported class 3 price that USDA puts out every month, that's going to be lower with these changes. And the same thing would be true for class 4. That actually reflects the fact that USDA increased those component values. So for example, we said you went from 3.1 to 3.3 on the protein side. That actually includes that. So that's why that number is smaller than the changes in those component values there. But what this is really saying is if your milk was consistently pooled and was getting primarily a class 3 value, which is fairly typical for this part of the world, and if you were doing it through a co-op, they weren't taking any of that money out, you're actually being paid the minimum price. That's where you see the biggest negative impact. Right? If your milk was not currently being pooled, we don't really have a good sense for what you were being paid because not all milk is regulated. We're going to show you a graph here in a minute that talks about here in the upper Midwest, at least, that bounced around a lot, how much milk was actually being pooled, and that actually made a big difference to what people are being paid. And then if you were marketing through a co-op, it's actually possible for the co-op to not pay that minimum, that thing we call the minimum regulated price, because the co-ops are considered legally to be the representative of producers. So if they were paid that by a milk buyer, if they choose to retain some of that to cover their own increases in manufacturing costs or distribute a little bit differently, that's actually allowable under our current system. So we don't really know for the people whose milk was in those last two categories, which actually could be a fair amount of the milk in this part of the world. We don't really know exactly what the impacts are likely to be. So it's important to think about those negative numbers that are there in the top center of the table as being important, and some farms could be affected that way. Other farms probably will not see the kind of changes that are that size that we're talking about there. So this is kind of giving you some sense for, it depends a lot on where you are currently in terms of how your milk is marketed and who you're selling it to. It's probably important to keep that in mind. Jack, why don't you go ahead?
So when we look at USDA's assessment of the price impacts, is in assessing price impacts, researchers often use a static backward-looking approach. So ultimately, what was the price that we observed? Then we implement the changes in the pricing formula, and then what was the difference between the original and then the calculated price based on the proposal? So kind of looking at across prices from January 2019 through December of 2023 across each of the orders, we can see that there was an overall kind of a positive increase in that original price and then what the recommended price would be. Although there were some negatives, particularly in the upper Midwest, the California order, and then the Arizona as well. So USDA looked at the blend price across orders for 5 years from 2019 to 2023. And these were calculated by assuming different pricing formulas. However, it's also important to realize that this does not account for dynamic effects of price changes. So when we think about how can we assess this, and specifically, how can we implement models that will incorporate the dynamic effects of the market? How can we assess this based on when should changes be made to the federal orders, and then what impacts on the farm milk prices will be the result of these changes? And we can do this, as economists, we do have an answer, and we can do this through economic modeling. So our research group has used economic modeling to inform recent changes to the Class 1 location differentials. So we have the United States Dairy Sector Simulator, which is a minimization of the cost of milk assembly between production, demand, and processing. And then graphically that Dr. Nicholson presented at the federal order hearings in October of 23, we can see the results for milk assembly at fluid milk plants and packaged milk distribution, kind of based on where those production nodes are, and then ultimately where that final product is being demanded across the United States, so across time and space. Ultimately, what this model led to was this model suggested that changes to the Class 1 differential should be implemented. And this was based on an October 2021 analysis that updates kind of what those county by county location differentials should be based on where milk is being produced, where it's being processed, and then where it's ultimately being demanded. And again, this was presented at the FMMO hearings in October of 2023. And this ultimately led to the final adoption by USDA to update the Class 1 differentials across the United States. And based on, in general, when we think about kind of some of the lower increases would be in North Dakota, northern Minnesota, and down to some of the largest increases up to $1.90, $2.20 across counties in the Southeast through Florida, kind of following that general trend of where milk is produced in the United States.
If I can jump in here a little bit, if you can maybe go back to that slide for a second. Thanks for mentioning kind of the pattern that USDA worked with. And I guess one of the key points here is USDA was looking at some of the kinds of work that we here at the University of Wisconsin and previously at Cornell University had developed to help think about what the values of milk are in different parts of the United States based on the amount of milk that's produced and also based on what it's used for and the processing capacities that we have in place. So the kind of tools that were developed were actually pretty important. It's a little bit hard to see maybe even if you're looking at this as a stream afterwards, but the values that came out of the analysis work that we had been involved with were really pretty similar to what USDA ultimately decided should be those values for Class 1. So previously we talked about the two main things that are going to affect the milk prices going forward are the make allowances, which was generally not a positive thing, although maybe not as negative as some of the values are reported. The other side is that the Class 1 differentials actually add money into the pool, so they're going to create additional value for dairy farms. And I like to joke a little bit that economists from the University of Wisconsin were involved in both of the analyses that led to that. My longtime friend and good colleague, who you may be familiar with, Mark Stevenson, who retired from UW-Madison here a couple of years ago, was at the center point of the work on manufacturing costs that led to the increases in make allowances. Don't blame him. USDA had to use the information. On the other side, I like to joke that while Mark was taking money out of dairy farmers' pockets, I was trying to put money back into dairy farmers' pockets by thinking about what those Class 1 differential values should be. So there is a bit of an offset here, particularly in parts of the country that have much more utilization of that Class 1 or beverage milk. For better or for worse here in Wisconsin, that's not going to be a big positive impact, but there will be some positive impact on the value of the milk pool that goes forward looking at that. So key things are there's impacts up and down on this make allowance and on the Class 1 differentials. And the kind of work that we've been involved with here was pretty important for what USDA decided to do in terms of making the changes that they made. So I'll hand it back over to you, Jack. Thanks for letting me butt in so much on this whole thing.
No worries. So I want to go back to this idea that milk prices are dynamic and that when we look back and assess what the price would have been based on changes to the formulas, it's important to recognize that those changes do not incorporate what the market was, and even more so, they do not incorporate what the market will be. So when we look at milk prices over the last 20 years, from 2000 to 2024, we can definitely see that there's an oscillatory pattern in prices, both for the all milk price as well as for the component price. And these oscillate based on market conditions. And when we look at kind of where we're at right now in that pattern, is we're kind of looking at from January 2024, we're kind of on that uptick a little bit in that oscillatory pattern, maybe with a little bit of down that occurred last year. But in general, we're kind of on that upward swing. But it's also important to recognize that when we look back on what the price would have been, we failed to incorporate what the market was. So ultimately, one of the limitations with static models is we can't predict what that future price would be. And ultimately, when we think about both the milk price, it's also hard to predict the percentage of milk both in Wisconsin and Minnesota that is pooled. So when we look at January of 2015, when we were close to about 100% of all the milk being pooled versus down to kind of January of 2012, which is about 75%, between 70 and 75% of all milk that was pooled, as it's also hard to think about what is being changed and how ultimately we can predict what are the pooling decisions that the cooperatives will implement. And that's kind of one of our goals with looking at these models is let's incorporate both what's happening in the market as well as pooling decisions on individual cooperatives as well. So the impacts to the prices will be dynamic. So largely, we know that with an increased make allowances, there will be a lower farm milk price for pooled milk. However, what this is going to do, this is going to increase demand for farm milk for cheese, and it's also going to make adjustments for costs to milk production. So ultimately, the milk supply and demand balance for milk that is being destined for cheese plants or for cheese will be affected. This is ultimately going to drive pressure for premiums in the long term. So as Dr. Nicholson said, there will be a short-term lower price based on those make allowances that are being subtracted out of the milk price. But when we think long-term, there will ultimately be a higher pressure for premiums, given that there will be incentive for processors to pool their milk through the federal orders. And this is going to offset a positive effect on the farm milk pay price when we think about some of the long-term implications. So with that increased make allowances, is we're going to see more milk pooled onto the federal order, again, ultimately driving for that offset to offset that positive effect on farm milk price. So ultimately, the long-term trend would be is that there will be a positive effect based on the increase in the make allowances. And when we look at kind of some of those static models that I talked about, is they kind of fail to incorporate some of these decisions made by cooperatives.
So, Jack, before you move on there, I'm going to ask the question that probably every producer is thinking when we're thinking about, okay, so long term, yes, it might add some premiums for those who are in like the pooled milk, but when? How long? Well, when does that normal quote unquote start for these premiums to potentially make an impact? And that is the hard question here today.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer to that question, but usually what we think about is on the order of 3, 4, 6 months, you would start to see some of those effects play out. So for example, if your milk is being pooled and you really did see a loss in component value due to the higher make allowances or a difference in the component value of close to $1 a hundredweight, as a dairy farmer, you would start thinking about, okay, do I start maybe thinking about my culling decisions a little bit differently? Do I think about my feeding program a little bit differently? So if you think about the time horizon over which dairy farms might think about making changes to some of those kinds of decisions, it won't be immediate, but it's not going to be like over 5 years. 5 years from now, we see something. It's more on the scale of within the next year or so, and it might even be half a year. That kind of be my best prediction based on how we're thinking about the responses of what dairy farms are going to do in terms of their management. Cheese buyers buyers of milk for cheese are also going to be thinking about that in a relatively similar kind of time frame. So it wouldn't surprise me if we saw that in the order of months rather than on the order of years.
Okay. Thank you for going into that. I know that's a little bit in the weeds, but as a producer, I think about, okay, so yes, this sounds great, but that timeline does help put things into perspective when we're talking about what this really looks like after implementation, even though you can't really forward predict with certainty, I should say. So
yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it should be on people's minds for sure.
Well, I'll let you guys continue on here.
So kind of in going on, building on looking at, how can we incorporate dynamic decisions into some models. So our research group does have a dynamic economic model that has been developed. So both Dr. Nicholson and, as he mentioned, Dr. Stevenson have developed a global dairy supply chain model. And what this model includes is it includes about 15 global regions, and it includes multiple final and intermediate dairy products along kind of that dairy supply chain. It's also important to recognize that these models can incorporate trade relationships, and this model actually does incorporate some of those trade relationships. And the model incorporates monthly data beginning in 2013. So we have this model for the global dairy supply chain, and we also have one for FMMO pricing across the United States as a whole, but we do not have this for individual orders across the United States. And when we think about kind of some of that dynamic model analysis on make allowance changes to component values to 2028, based on some of the previous work that Dr. Nicholson has done, we can see that in 24 and 25 and 26, that in general, there's a decrease in the class 3 price and the class 3 and class 4 component values. However, when we begin thinking about outward looking and what that forward horizon looks like, we can see increases in both 2027 in the class 4 price, as well as the class 4 components. And then we see that going into 2028 and overall aggregated across the time frame looking forward, we can see that there would be some increases in the class 4 price and the class 3 component values based on the current existing dynamic models that incorporate some of those factors that we've discussed this afternoon. Now, in the values that are presented here, and I'm talking about the component values themselves and how they're going to change both positively or negatively in the future, these values only account for milk that is currently pooled. And if milk is not being pooled or being reblended, the price impacts could be smaller and also could be negative when thinking about the results out of the model. So ultimately, we need new economic models to analyze the federal milk marketing orders. And we currently have models that represent the spatial organization of the dairy industry. As I talked about, we have the United States Dairy Sector Simulator, which was used for the Class 1 location differentials. However, this model only looks at prices month by month at a time and is not necessarily dynamic. We also have models that represent the dynamics of milk supply and product demand over time, but it's overall with a limited number of regions and only based on geographic regions in the United States, not specific milk marketing order areas. And we currently don't have models that combine all of these elements. So again, kind of building on our discussion of why we need new economic models to analyze the federal milk orders, is we currently don't have the models that combine all of these elements. So ultimately, why are these models needed and why are they important for future policy discussions? And it's that future changes to the FMMO pricing formulas can be better addressed when they're assessed in advance. And that's kind of addressing some of the limitations of existing models. We also can assess possible future deregulation scenarios. So there has been a lot of conversation within the dairy industry about what could price impacts be if we dissolved an order or had a little bit less pricing regulation. And in general, we don't really have what the price would be with who those, if we deregulated and abolished some of the orders. And ultimately, that's one of the goals we want to address in these new economic models. What could that price be if we removed a federal order and had some deregulation scenarios?
Yeah, maybe I can ask you to go back to that. I'll jump in here with some additional comments that might be helpful for folks. But Amber, you had just raised the question about how long is it going to take? And we showed a little bit about, some of how that would work. But notice that what USDA did, where they said, here's what would have happened from 2019 to 2023, that doesn't tell us anything about how long it would take in 2025 for these kinds of changes to play out. And that's not a criticism of kind of the capacity of what USDA has to work with, but it's kind of a general limitation of our ability to think through how that's going to play out in different regions of the US in particular, that is going to capture the kind of the decision making on the part of milk buyers and dairy farmers. So that's part of where we're trying to go with these tools, to actually be better able to answer exactly that kind of question that you asked. And the second thing that I think is actually really important is, I mean, I've been thinking about federal marketing orders, I guess, for more than 25 years now. And it seems that uh, they're always 10 years away from going away. I think we're maybe getting closer to the point where people are thinking seriously about whether we need to maintain this system of milk pricing or whether alternatives might be desirable. But I would argue, particularly because lots of dairy industry organizations have made and are continuing to make billion-dollar investments in like processing capacity and transportation networks that would be very much affected if we got rid of this pricing system. We want to have a better sense going forward of what that world might look like if we don't have these things anymore. Because there's kind of a lot of money riding on the line, particularly through dairy cooperative investments in processing and transportation infrastructure that could be pretty affected if we make changes sort of too abruptly. So we're trying to make the case that we need better information about how this might look going forward. Go ahead, Jack, back to you.
All right, so kind of talking about what the next generation of models could look like. So ultimately, one of the things that we've talked about in our research group is using agent-based models to predict the impacts to changes to federal orders. So what are these agent-based models, or ABMs? They are designed to simulate decision-making through interaction among individual farms, cooperatives, and processors. So very kind of on that, developing models that incorporate specific changes that those individual players would make. And they also are able to incorporate changes to pricing, pooling, and policy changes over time with an important spatial dimension. And that spatial dimension in our case is across each one of the federal milk marketing orders. So what does this look like kind of across the entire dairy industry? So in general, we have dairy farms, and in our case, and hypothetically and theoretically speaking, we've got farms, one farm or two farms, up to farms going to infinity. We also know that these farms supply milk to either processors, and these processors are either going to be a cooperative or to private handlers. And in some cases, there's going to be milk flow from cooperatives to a private handler, and milk flows from the private handler to the processors. So once the milk is processed and a dairy food or dairy product is manufactured, ultimately there has to be a buyer on the end of that. And we can aggregate buyers based on three different categories. The first is food service, the second is food manufacturing, and kind of that last one is going to a retailer, which is directly to the consumers. So the agents in this case are the farms, the processors, and the buyers. And then we think about what are the decisions that are built into this model? Well, when we look at the farm level, our decisions that are made on farm are going to be production decisions, marketing decisions. How are we going to market our milk? Is that going to be to a private handler, a private processor, a cooperative? And then when we think about the processors themselves, what are their purchasing decisions? How do they make production decisions based on what demand is? What products will they make? What's their R&D look like for future products? And then ultimately pooling decisions about how much milk they are going to pool on the order. And lastly, when we think about buyers and what's driving all of this is what are the purchasing decisions on the back end? What are consumers demanding? What are food manufacturers demanding for dairy-based ingredients? And what's being demanded in food service, particularly driven by things such as the school lunch program, restaurants, and ultimately, what's the purchasing behavior that's driving all dairy product demand through this model? And most importantly, the interactions among all of these interactions between farms, cooperatives, private handlers, and the interactions between the cooperatives and food services, food manufacturers, retailers is key to building out these models. And lastly, but not least, we want to look at this from a spatial dimension as well. So we can look at specific areas such as the upper Midwest Federal Order 30 or another Midwest order, which would be the Mideast Federal Order, which is Federal Order 33. So when we look at some of the previous work done on agent-based models for federal milk marketing orders, the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service the Dairy Division did support a small preliminary project in 2018. And the model provided insights as to how to further develop agent-based models for federal milk marketing orders. However, in general, based on kind of some of that preliminary steps that was done in 2018, we recognize that there are some future steps we need to take for agent-based modeling. And one of the things we're looking at is a potential collaboration with Federal Order 30, the Federal Order Milk Marketing Administrator's Office, to support further model development, including data and decision rules. And we actually have a verbal agreement from Federal Order 30 to be involved with this project. So it's currently on hold right now, given some USDA funding restrictions and some of the stuff happening at USDA, but stay tuned for some of the future steps that we built and some of the future research is generated based on this relationship. But lastly, these agent-based models are not just important for understanding federal milk marketing orders. They can help us understand the entire dairy supply chain and what's happening. In particular, kind of a really hot button topic right now is how to assess the impacts of trade policies, in particular tariffs. They can also help us address and understand what the evolution and structural changes to the dairy industry might be, and what that would be based on location and the size of dairy farms spread across the United States, as well as impacts on food and nutrition program spending and what that looks like for impacts to the dairy industry. So overall, our conclusions is we understand that new economic modeling tools are needed to inform us about impacts of future changes to the federal milk marketing orders, and whether that be to price changes and deregulations. We also know that agent-based models are very promising for approaching the next generation of model development to help understand these changes. And we have got some preliminary work that has been completed. We're currently sorting out some funding for some of the future activities, but in general, we recognize that there is a need for these models and that there's also kind of some relevant answers to the dairy industry that can be answered out of these models. So overall, I just want to thank everybody for your attention this afternoon. And I think Dr. Nicholson and I would be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Well, sounds wonderful. I definitely have some questions here for you as well. I do have to say and make a comment though. It really sounds like, and please correct me if I'm like understanding things wrong here, but Dr. Nicholson, I always joke, can you tell us the future, read that crystal ball? And it sounds like that within this type of modeling, we're going to be able to not get there, but make it a little bit closer when we make some of those assessments. So it's going to be very exciting to see what comes of this information in these agent-based modeling systems. But one of the questions I have is when we're discussing these systems, what are the limitations or the areas that we're not going to be getting as much information as we maybe think we are, or it's just not quite there yet or possible to assess certain information that we currently have?
So that's a great question. And actually, let me start by maybe reiterating some of the limitations of the ways that we have now. So Jack mentioned we can look back, and that's not quite like looking into the crystal ball. That's kind of like driving by looking in the rearview mirror, which generally is not that good an idea. And the tools that we have kind of get at little pieces of this, like, what should that class 1 differential be based on where milk was in 2021? Doesn't tell us a lot about what the class 1 differential should be in 2025 or 2029, right? And similarly, we don't have a good sense for the broad decisions that are being made about milk being pooled and what premiums are paid if milk is not being pooled or might be paid in the future. And so what we're trying to do to kind of better not drive looking in the rearview mirror and also better understand that is really think at a more basic level about the decisions that the key decision makers in the dairy supply chain are going to make. And that's dairy farmers, that's milk buyers and cooperatives, and that's dairy product buyers and ultimately dairy product consumers. And one of the advantages that we get when we actually think about things that way is we're not entirely sure. We're clearly not sure how every dairy farmer is going to make a decision, but we have a way to sort of say, what difference does it make if dairy farmers kind of think like this and make a decision this way versus a decision that way? And I think I'm going to joke with Jack a little bit. I think you talked about infinite number of dairy farms. That might be some kind of paradise, but we're not there yet. We can talk about having a lot of them, and that's another part of this, is that we don't have to think about like all of Wisconsin. We can think about individual farms, or a much larger representative set of people who are making decisions on dairy farms and milk buyers and that kind of thing. So that gives us some advantages. So those are major steps forward in terms of how we do the analysis of the changes. And I guess we're trying to argue that that would be a good thing. It would be informative. The challenge is the industry is a dynamic place. Stuff has changed a lot. If you think about back before 2020, we had no idea COVID was coming. We had no idea that a federal marketing order hearing was going to start in 2023 and carry on to where we are now. So in the space of 4 or 5 years, there's a lot of external stuff that can happen that will affect what will actually play out in the industry. We have some ways that we can play around with thinking about what those would look like, but we don't have that perfect crystal ball that says, oh, in 2027, it's going to be exactly like that. Okay. But it's a step in the direction of helping decision makers be more informed when they're making decisions that we think is actually really pretty important. So I hope that kind of addressed the basic question that you had there.
I think it does. And I think it helps put in perspective that you aren't going to be able to, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to truly tell the future and really rake in those big bucks by knowing what's going to happen before it happens. But you're going to have an idea of how to proceed as a business, whether you are a processor, a buyer, or a dairy producer, depending on what is likely to happen, let's say. So going off of, some of these things that you're talking about, and you mentioned that the dairy industry is so dynamic. And the changes that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years alone are absolutely incredible in so many different ways, good, bad, and otherwise. But with some of those, it comes that, and I can't remember, correct me if I'm wrong, let's just put it that way. I believe on one of the slides, it said that it can take into impact some of the policy changes. How does that work? Because we know, given any administration, that the world may flip on its head. And I feel like, that is one of those factors that feels almost impossible to predict.
Yeah, so particularly in the kind of current environment, so I work closely with some folks who are not dairy type economists. They'll work on like potatoes and cranberries in the state of Wisconsin. And their basic take is farmers shouldn't worry about those policy changes because they can't control them. They should figure out what's going to be best for their own farm management, partly related to risk that's going to be beneficial given kind of whatever happens. And I completely agree that particularly in the environment now, it's difficult to predict what those policies are going to be. In fact, for that matter, we couldn't predict what the USDA's dairy division was going to do with federal marketing order hearings until we got to the final decision and they said, here's what we're thinking about. So where we can make a contribution is to say, we're not the politicians who are making decisions, but we can say, if somebody does this, here's what we think is likely to happen over this time frame. If they do this other thing, here's what we think is likely to happen. And maybe that helps to make for a little bit more informed decision making about the kinds of directions that we want to go with policy. I kind of call it the what if type thing. Well, what if you did that? Well, here's what we think how that would play out. So that's where we can make a contribution. We like to think that people take that a little bit into account when they're thinking about the what that they're going to do. Doesn't always work that way, but there have been cases here with federal order hearing in particular, where that information was taken into account and became part of the decision making. So that's kind of how we're viewing how we might be useful in this process, even if we're not there at the side of dairy farmers thinking about the specific farm management decisions.
Well, I think that is a really great way to put it, and helps, put the pieces together and help understand how the puzzle is all being made, and what it does it mean from the different levels and aspects that we all play in the industry. With all that being said, I am looking at my clock and I'm like, holy man, we're at 1 o'clock. So I do apologize because I did not know where the time went. Well, I guess I know where it went. It was me writing notes. To kind of wrap things up here this afternoon, to keep us on time and to keep everybody moving throughout their day here. When we're thinking about today's discussion, Dr. Nicholson and Jack, what are that 1 or 2 key points you want producers or industry members or anybody who's listening to really take away and be thinking about after today's discussion?
Jack, you want to go first?
Yep, I can start off. So I think one of the big things is ultimately there are changes coming this year. What that might look like, what's happening globally with dairy demand and what's happening both in the United States. I think that ultimately the proof will be in the pudding, so to speak. And I think ultimately the big thing is know that there are changes coming to the milk price this year. And kind of on the flip side of that is I think there's some value for building out these models for the dairy industry to get good, valuable questions. So, when we looking at, what could happen to federal orders, what could happen to some other policies, what happens with trade agreements, ultimately we want models that can answer these questions for the industry and get us not an answer that's close, but get us an answer of, well, based on the what if situation, this is the result we get out of it.
I'll get my 2 points here real quickly. So if you're a farm where your milk has been pooled consistently and you've been paid that minimum price, you might want to pay attention to what's going on with the changes in component values that might affect a little bit your nutritional strategy on your farm and consulting with your nutritionist as well as perhaps your co-op there. And on the other side, we think it's generally a good idea to kind of be informed a little bit about where these changes come from, how the decisions are made, the kind of information that gets used. Not so much for specific farm management decisions, but for dairy industry organization type conversations about what co-ops might want to see happen next, for example. And also to kind of facilitate an understanding and conversations with whoever your milk buyer is. So I think we hope we provided some information that kind of helps frame that up a little bit and makes those conversations happen a little bit more readily. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, Dr. Nicholson and Jack, I appreciate your time. And especially as you're mentioning here on the end, the Dairy Signal not only provides, things you can immediately do on farm, but things to be thinking about or information on how you can be better informed, not only on what you do, but why things are happening around you. So you feel like you have the knowledge base to go about whether it's discussions with your processors or other producers or anybody in between. It's a great knowledge base to have. And I have to say, I'm excited to see what this modeling is going to be coming about, especially as the world continues turning and the dynamic industry that we're in has so much to be interested in seeing how certain factors play into everything here today. So appreciate your guys' time so much and hope you guys have a great rest of your afternoon. I have to say, since we're a little bit over, I'm just going to skip right to we'll see you here tomorrow on the Dairy Signal. Stay safe, have a great day, and have a good rest of your afternoon. Bye now.